Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Kenneth Miller. He is a professor of cell biology and the Royce Family Professor for Teaching Excellence at Brown University. Miller is an outspoken proponent of the theory of evolution, participating in debates and providing expert testimony in court. Miller is also a practicing Roman Catholic who does not find his belief in God to be incompatible with his scientific views. Miller has written 2 books exploring the relationship between religious faith and evolution. The first was Finding Darwin's God, a scientist's search for common ground between God and evolution, published in 1999, and more recently, Only a Theory, Evolution and the Battle for America's Soul, 2008. The second book explores the controversy surrounding the teaching of intelligent design. Miller has also written more than 50 scientific articles and co-authored 5 high school and college biology texts. Kenneth Miller was the Oregon Humanities Center 2008-2009 Kritikos Professor. He gave a lecture entitled Time to Abandon Darwin, Evolution and the Battle for America's Soul on May 27th at the UO in Eugene and on May 28th in Portland, with a second lecture entitled Darwin, God, and Design, America's Continuing Problem with Evolution. Ken, thank you for coming.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
It's very nice of you to take the time to talk to us here on camera today for the interview, as well as to give these lectures. I've been immersed in your writing for the last couple of days, and I wanted to start by going back to a court case you participated in 2005. You testified for the plaintiffs in the Kitzmiller v. Dover Area School District case. I think it was the first direct challenge brought in the U.S. federal courts against a public school district that required the presentation of intelligent design as an alternative to evolution. Could you talk about the importance of that case as a landmark event?
Well, I think the case was important for a number of reasons. The Dover Area School Board was the first school board in the United States to mandate the teaching of a subject called intelligent design, and everybody wanted to see how this would work out. And what they actually did was to instruct their science department. It's a small town. There's only 4 teachers in that science department. And they instructed them to prepare a curriculum on this idea called intelligent design. Those 4 teachers, at the risk of losing their jobs, refused to do that. And the school board was actually reduced to writing their own lesson on intelligent design and then having the superintendent go into the classroom and read that lesson to the students. The day on which they did that, the day after they did that, 11 parents went to district court, federal district court in Harrisburg, and swore out a First Amendment complaint against the school district. And what they argued was the following. Intelligent design is a concept that basically says that the elements of design, intentional, craftsman-like design, can be detected in living systems. And the way you can detect them is that some elements of the structure of the cell, biochemical pathways, and so forth, are so complex that allegedly they couldn't possibly have been produced by the process of evolution, so they must have been designed or created in these organisms. So essentially, what the school board did was to write a lesson on this. They also purchased 2 classroom sets of an intelligent design textbook called Pandas and People, and they tried to institute this curriculum. Now, the reason the case was significant was because the parents charged that intelligent design was in fact religious in nature. And by advancing this idea, this agency of government, and that's what a school board is a government agency. This agency of government was trying to advance one religious idea to the expense and to the exclusion, at the expense and to the exclusion of all others. And that was the basis of the First Amendment case. So this was an enormously important case for that reason, and also from the fact that the case came before a judge beginning his 4th year on the bench. His name is John E. Jones III. He had a reputation as a conservative jurist, a strict constructionist, who was appointed to the bench by President George W. Bush. And the advocates of intelligent design figured, we're going to get a fair hearing from this guy because he's a conservative judge, he's appointed by President Bush. This is a venue in which we can make the case that intelligent design is a valid scientific theory. The importance of that case was that exactly the opposite happened. And the notion that intelligent design had any coherent or valid science to it simply fell apart. The trial lasted for 7 weeks and was a complete intellectual, legal, and you might even say a moral defeat for the advocates of this idea.
presumably the faculty were reinstated or took up their jobs again and went back to a more standard biology curriculum?
Well, they never lost their jobs in the first place. They simply said, we're not going to do this. And the school board, a couple members of the school board quietly threatened them with their jobs, but nothing came of that. And they had it's worth noting, they also had very strong backing from the teachers union, who would have supported them if the board had attempted to dismiss them over an intellectual issue like this. But what happened there's something else that's interesting about this trial. The trial lasted, as I mentioned, for 7 weeks. A trial on a constitutional issue is always heard by a judge, because you don't want a jury deciding that the Fifth Amendment means this thing in New Hampshire and means something else in California. So this issue was heard by a judge. When the trial was over, the judge does not give his opinion immediately. And the reason for that is, first of all, he has to make up his mind. And second of all, the judge's finding is accompanied by a report, by a written decision. And it was clearly going to take the judge several weeks to write the decision. So when the case concluded, nobody really knew what the decision of the judge would be. Now, it turned out that 4 days after the end of the trial, Dover had a school board election. So almost the entire school board who had voted for this policy was up for re-election. Nobody knew what the judge's decision would be. But the members of the town of Dover, the citizens of the town of Dover who had seen all of the facts come to light in this trial, quite frankly, were put off by what their school board had actually done. And they voted the entire school board out of office before they ever heard from the judge himself. So the other importance of this case is in exposing what was behind this intelligent design policy. That exposure completely undercut any popular support that the school board had and led to a democratic decision in a free election, which backed up the eventual judge's decision that intelligent design wasn't science, and that in fact this really was a violation of the First Amendment rights of the parents of the school kids in Dover.
I see that it really was a landmark decision.
Yeah.
And this was in 2005. Your first book came out in 1999. I'm assuming that you were drawn into this case and other kinds of discussions on the national level about intelligent design versus evolution because you made your mark with this first book?
Well, I think Finding Darwin's God probably had something to do with it. But there's more to it than that. It turns out that I am the co-author, along with a guy named Joseph Levine, of a very widely used high school biology textbook. It's simply called Biology by Miller and Levine. It's published by Prentice Hall, by Pearson Publishing. It's used all over the country. The immediate event that precipitated the intelligent design policy was that the school board had told the science department they had enough money to replace their old used biology textbooks. The teachers sat down, they looked at all the available textbooks, and they picked ours. Members of the school board had to review that decision. They looked through our book and they discovered not only did our book have a couple chapters on evolution, it had a whole unit on evolution. In fact, one of the members of the school board said this book is laced with Darwinism from cover to cover, and that's why he objected to it. And in effect, they developed the intelligent design policy partially in reaction to our textbook. So one of the reasons that I was called as an expert witness in the trial, I was actually the lead witness for the plaintiffs, is not only because I'd been outspoken on the issue of evolution, but also because I was the co-author of the very textbook that they wished to have in the classrooms for the kids in Dover. When the court case was over, this policy was invalidated, a new school board was seated. The school board today actually includes a couple of the plaintiffs from the original case, so the plaintiffs got their way, and the school teachers were able to reinstitute the biology curriculum, including evolution, that they had previously.
And are they using your textbook?
They still are, and they'll probably use it for a couple more years, at least until the books get so beat up that they have to be replaced.
Which happens a lot in high schools.
Unfortunately, it does.
Now, that great phrase, laced with Darwinism, is so contemptuous and so clearly indicative of a very highly polarized debate here.
Yeah, although my co-author and I, we've joked, you know how sometimes you put back cover endorsements on books?
Yes.
In the context of biology educators, we think laced with Darwinism is actually an endorsement, and we might put it on the textbook in the future.
It may well help you sell
Sure.
future editions of that book. But what I wanted to work around to was the real extreme in the polemic and the rhetoric in this particular issue. People talk about the evolution wars. It's really a very strong kind of rhetoric.
Oh, yeah.
And people get very heated about it. In fact, I'm sure discussion following your public lectures often gets pretty heated. I'm curious curious though, one of the things that you do that I've seen you explain very well in other public venues is that you bring nuance and complexity to our understanding of the concept of intelligent design. And so one of the things I wanted to ask you to explain was the difference between the concept of intelligent design and, say, creationism. Because those are not the same things, right?
Well, there probably is a difference between them, but I'm on record as saying that intelligent design is a form of creationism. And here's what I mean. Classically, creationism usually is adherence to what you might call a biblical view of creation, which is to say that the earth is maybe 6,000 or 7,000 years old, that all living things, alive today or extinct, were simultaneously created in a single 6-day creation week, and furthermore, that all the world's geological formations, all of the fossils, all the sediments and formations were formed during a single 40-day and 40-night worldwide flood. To me, that's what classic, you might call it young earth, creationism actually means. Now, the intelligent design movement got its start after that kind of young earth creationism was determined by the Supreme Court to be inherently a religious doctrine. And this was in the case of Edwards versus Aguillard, which was decided by the Supreme Court in 1987. And in effect, what the opponents of evolution found themselves bound to do was to come up with a new strategy. And the strategy they came up with, quite frankly, is now called intelligent design. And what intelligent design tries to do is to get around some of the other problems with so-called creation science by saying, we don't know how old the Earth is. Maybe it really is 4.5 billion years old, just like the scientists say. We don't think. We don't have an opinion on this worldwide flood. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. And instead they focused on what you might call the absolute minimum. And that absolute minimum is that this force, or this agent, which they call an intelligent designer, played a critical role in the formation of the key features of biological systems. Now, they use the word design constantly. It's almost, and I hate to joke about it this way, but it's almost like they went to an indoctrination camp in which any time they muttered the word creation, an electric current was sent through their body until they learned not to say create and instead to say design. But think about it. If you say that the animals of the Cambrian explosion or beautiful little intracellular machines like the bacterial flagellum were designed, what do you really mean? Well, you don't just mean they were designed, that they were drafted out on some sort of a cosmic drafting board. You actually mean that the genes that specify these structures or these pathways were actually created by a creative force. So intelligent design is really a doctrine of special creation, since everything which is said to be designed, in fact, actually had to be created. So the common core of both of these ideas is that evolution doesn't work, that evolution is invalid, and that creation events are required to account for the origin and the appearance of life on Earth.
Got it. Okay, so really it's a way of removing some of the more inflammatory or more easily opposed piece of the doctrine and reshaping the concept a little bit.
That's true. And it's also worth noting that some of the advocates of intelligent design speak of intelligent design as a big tent strategy. And they say we can put under this big tent not only the people who really do think the Earth is 6,000 years old and the Adam and Eve story is real authentic biological natural history, but also people who simply have a philosophical objection to what they call evolutionism. And by putting all of them under the big tent, we can dispose of the common enemy, which is Darwinism. And once we've disposed of that, then we can get about squabbling among ourselves about our individual differences. And one of the senior fellows of the Discovery Institute, a think tank in Seattle, Washington, which has been a notable advocate of intelligent design, Paul Nelson, actually wrote a paper called The Big Tent Strategy, Inside the Big Tent, where he articulated the very strategy that I've just described.
Thank you for giving me that additional precision. Now, what about irreducible complexity? Does that actually provide proof for intelligent design?
Well, the advocates of the idea would like to think that it does. Irreducible complexity is a concept that was developed by Michael Behe, who is a professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. And here's the essence of the argument. Living cells, and I'm a cell biologist, this is my field, living cells are just loaded with these beautiful, complicated multi-part protein machines. Some of them produce movement, some of them pump ions from one side of the cell to the other, some of them replicate DNA or make proteins. And the one thing that these machines have in common is that they're made of multiple protein parts. So if you look at a complicated system, like the little flagellum that spins around on the outside of certain cells and propels them through liquid, what you discover is anywhere from 30 to 40 individual proteins have to be put together in exactly the right arrangement to form the flagellum. So it's complex. The notion of irreducible complexity is as follows. It's a claim that you need all the parts of this system to be assembled simultaneously, hence it's irreducible, in order to have a functioning system. Now, if that were true, you can make the argument, as Behe does, that evolution could never produce such a system. And here's why. If you need all 40 parts for this thing to work, you can't evolve 20 of them, and those 20 would be absolutely useless, somehow knowing that a million years from now you'll make part 21, and another million years you'll make part 22, hoping that at some point in the distant future you'll put in that 39th part, still no function, then you plug in the 40th part, whoosh, the thing spins to life and you have a functioning machine. Evolution has no foresight. It cannot do anything like that. So if the claim that all these parts had to be completely assembled in order to have function were true, it would in fact be a very strong argument against evolution. So what I did, and what I've done in publications and what I did in the trial, was to take that claim at face value and say, is it true? Well, it turns out that for the bacterial flagellum, evolution would make a very specific prediction. And that prediction is that when you take these 40 parts and you disassemble them, you should discover that the individual components actually originate with different functions, and that new functions emerge as these components are gradually put together, so that at every step in the way, you actually have a functioning machine that perhaps does something else, but nonetheless something that can be favored by natural selection. When you actually look at the bacterial flagellum, you quickly discover that there are subsets of parts within it that do all sorts of different things. Some of them are involved in a process called signal transduction, some of them are involved in secretory system, but at every step along the way, you can understand how these subsets have functions of their own. So you can look at this claim and say, is the claim valid? For the claim to be valid, you should not have individual parts that have selectable functions of their own. You look at the system, it turns out the individual parts do have selectable functions of their own, therefore the argument falls apart.
Got it. But it really does require a kind of an argumentation that is based very much in science and in expert science, as opposed to just, say, a humanist scientific versus a religious doctrine.
Oh, I think that's true. And one of the reasons why the intelligent design movement had some initial success is precisely because, you know, most people don't study biochemistry in high school or in college. And it really does take someone who understands the basics of genetics and biochemistry and molecular genetics to dissect the argument and see why it fails. And what I've tried to do, and what other people who have defended evolution have tried to do, is to make these arguments interpretable in terms that lay people can understand. This is certainly something we had to do in this trial. I like to joke that we had to boil this argument down into terms that were so simple that even an attorney could understand them. And we were successful in doing that.
I'm sure that went over very well with the attorneys.
Yeah, well, the attorneys didn't like it very much, but they recognized the necessity of doing it that way.
Yeah, you're very good at the debate, at the give and take, at the public presentation of the arguments on both sides. I saw your interview with Stephen Colbert, for example, and you certainly gave as good as you got. You kept up with him. You made that audience laugh. You had them in stitches.
Well, as I told Mr. Colbert afterwards when he asked me about that, I said, look, I grew up in New Jersey, so by definition, I'm a wise guy, and it comes from a misspent youth of argument and sarcasm. And I think that stands you very well in environments like that.
It's paying off handsomely now,
yes,
isn't
indeed.
it? That leads me to the question about whether the controversy about evolution is in itself a subject that is worth teaching. Do we need to start talking to students at the high school level, and perhaps before and certainly after, about this sort of growing field of inquiry?
Well, I think it's worthwhile to expose students to the relationship between science and society and the effect that scientific ideas have on social structures, on philosophy, on religion, and just on human relations. But I'm always a little nervous when I hear the word expose students to the controversy, because it turns out that within the scientific community, evolution is not a controversial idea. Evolution is a hardworking theory that we apply every day in the laboratory, that scientists here, for example, at the U of O, find evidence for all the time. So what we don't want to do is to imply a false controversy where none exists in scientific terms. It is certainly true that evolution in the general public remains a controversial idea, and in many opinion polls, the American people split right down the middle in terms of whether or not they accept the theory of evolution or not. I think as an educator we got to change that, not because of advocacy for evolution, but I think we got to change that because it shows that too many Americans do not have a sufficient knowledge of science and the scientific process.
Yeah, and in fact what I was thinking was not so much to add this to the lesson on Darwinism in a biology classroom, but in fact to explore it as something that is current in American culture in a course, say, called Values and Beliefs. It's something that my son's high school offers right now.
Well, I think that's, your son goes to an exceptional high school if they have a course like that, and I think that's terrific. I'd also like to see more of our public schools offer courses in philosophy and in religious studies. Mm-hmm. The sad truth is, especially with the testing-driven curriculum we have these days, not that many schools are able to offer courses in these very deep ideas outside of the basics. I did hear one suggestion that maybe intelligent design could be taken up by the social studies department as a social phenomenon. Well, I have a daughter who is a social studies teacher, and she was very quick to tell me, Dad, we got enough controversial stuff to deal with. We got slavery, we got the treatment of the Indians, we've got wars. Please don't throw intelligent design into our lap as well.
Okay, well, we won't ask our high school teachers, our hardworking high school teachers, to take on that one as well. But to go back to something you said about half of America, or that America is split pretty much down the middle on this big debate.
Yeah.
Is there something in the American character, do you think, that is stoking this controversy?
Well, I think there is, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. The American culture, and this is something I explored in my new book, Only a Theory, the American culture shows a profound disrespect for authority. You know, one of the common things you'll hear Americans say is, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? One of my European friends actually once asked me, you have all these controversies about evolution, why don't you grab a few scientists from Harvard and Yale, send them out to the hinterlands, have them explain to people how many societies they belong to and how many degrees they have, and tell them you should listen to us, and that surely would solve the problem. And I responded to my European friends, you don't really know Americans very well, do you? You can send the biggest expert from Harvard or Yale or Stanford in front of a local board of education in Nebraska or Kansas or Wyoming. They might be listened to for 3 minutes. The school board would then say thank you very much, and they would do whatever they darned well please, knowing very well that their constituency were the voters in that community and not the academics from these ivory tower institutions. Americans are very practical people. That's one of the reasons I think we have embraced and really love science. I think we're a scientific nation almost by temperament. But we also are a contrarian people. We like to stick our thumbs in the face of authority. We like to say we'll make up our own minds. And I think what that means basically is that we in the scientific community have to do a much better job at popularizing science. Now, I don't just mean making science sound like it's really cool and groovy. I mean at getting the message of science out. For example, the most profound evidence that I think, and I think most scientists would agree with this, the most profound evidence of human evolution, of our common ancestry with other organisms, is actually to be found not in fossils, there's plenty of it there, but in human DNA, in our own genome. And that evidence is so strong and so powerful, you just cannot understand it any other way. I often go around, and at UO, I explained this in my lecture, showing that one of our chromosomes was actually formed by the recent fusion of two chromosomes that are still separate in other primates, like the gorilla, the orangutan, and the chimpanzee. In our own genome, you can see the mark of the recent fusion between these two chromosomes, and it's perfectly obvious that we share a common ancestor with organisms like the animals that I just mentioned, in which those chromosomes were separate. When audiences hear that, and I see this all the time, I can see their mouths drop. They wonder, why haven't I ever heard of this very easy to understand and very compelling evidence? And I always tell them, I know whose fault that is, that you haven't heard it. It's my fault. And it's the fault of every other person in the scientific community, because we've known this for years and we haven't communicated it adequately. I'm convinced if we do a better job of that, ultimately we can win the American people over for the cause of science.
That's a great answer. Thank you for that. And you'll be glad to know that in the other lectures that have happened in the Darwin series we've run here on campus this year, we've had really brilliant demonstrations of how close our DNA is to our other animal relatives. So it's been a very instructive winter and spring.
Good.
We don't have a whole lot of time left, so I feel almost guilty asking you this question with not a whole lot of time to elaborate on the answer, but can you tell us the short form of how you reconcile your faith with your science?
Well, here's the short answer.
Okay.
If two ideas are not in conflict, then they don't have to be reconciled. And to me, what evolution tells me as a Christian, as a Roman Catholic, is that God is a whole lot more clever than people might have thought he was 100 years ago or 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. Because we live on a planet that is simply bursting with evolutionary possibilities, with forms of life that are able to adapt and change and deal with the harshest environmental conditions over time. The evolution is a process that gave rise literally to every living thing on this planet and gave rise to us as well. So when I look at this planet packed with evolutionary potential, with the extraordinary beauty and diversity of life, it's very easy for me, and I think it's very easy for most religious people, to see this as the ultimate work of a creator who wanted a universe that would be fruitful and creative like this, and established a process built into the physical world that was able to bring about that will. And to me, that's the ultimate reconciliation.
That's another wonderful answer. I can tell that you are very practiced at this, and that's a great way to...
Well, you ask good questions.
I invite viewers of this particular interview to look at the recorded version of the talk here on the U of O campus, which will be available on the U of O website eventually so that they can hear the elaboration of all of this. Do you have any idea what's coming next? Your new book is just out. What happens next?
Well, what happens next is I will continue to do the teaching that I do and the research at Brown University. I look forward to a summer this year of umpiring fast-pitch softball, which is one of my avocations. I umpire high school, college, and club softball. And I'm working on a new book on the biology of human nature, and I hope to have that finished in a year or so.
I hope we can bring you back so you can talk to us about that one.
This is a wonderful place. I'd be delighted to come back.
Thanks for coming to talk to us, Ken.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
We've been speaking with Kenneth Miller, professor of cell biology at Brown University. He gave lectures on May 27th and 28th as the Oregon Humanities Center 2008-09 Kritikos Professor. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.